The mass shadow alarm went off at 0347 station time, and I was already awake. I had been reviewing routine telemetry from the Sol system observation buoys when the deep-range sensors began screaming. Not a soft alert, not a yellow band anomaly that could wait until morning, the kind of alarm that makes your secondary heart stutter and your hands go cold before your brain even catches up with what your eyes are reading. I am Velkareth, senior observer aboard the Galactic Council monitoring frigate, Serene Doctrine. I have served the Council for 41 years. I have catalogued the birth of a pulsar, documented a first contact event with a pre-spaceflight species, and once sat 600 kilometers from a collapsing gas giant while my junior staff ran for the escape pods. I do not rattle easily. That alarm rattled me. I pulled the sensor feed to my primary screen and leaned in. A mass shadow, the gravitational distortion that any large object leaves behind when it exits faster than light travel, had appeared at coordinates just inside the outer boundary of the Sol system. The computer had already tried to classify it. It had failed, not because the data was unclear, because the object responsible for that shadow did not match any known vessel profile in the entire Council database. The database held records of over 6,000 registered ship classes from 231 spacefaring species. Not one match. My junior analyst, a young Valorian named Peth, appeared at my side without being summoned. She had seen the alert on her own console. Her pale blue skin had gone nearly white. "Observer," she said, her voice careful and flat, the way voices get when the owner is trying very hard to stay calm. "That mass reading is inconsistent." "I know," I said. "The computer has attempted 3 recalibrations. I know that too. It keeps arriving at the same figure." I looked at her. "What figure?" She showed me the screen rather than saying it out loud. I understood why. Some numbers are easier to absorb through your eyes than through your ears. The estimated displacement mass of the object that had just dropped into normal space at the edge of the Sol system was approximately 14 million metric tons. To give that some context, the Serene Doctrine, a mid-weight Council monitoring frigate considered quite capable for its role, massed just over 1 million metric tons. The largest warship in the Council's Joint Defensive Fleet, a dreadnought called the Voice of Reason, operated by the Cathari Directorate, massed 3.2 million. Whatever had just arrived was more than 4 times the size of the biggest warship any species in the known galaxy had ever chosen to build. I opened a communication channel. Standard protocol. Identification request. Broadcast on all registered hailing frequencies. My hands were steady. I was proud of that. The response came in 11 seconds. Not a delay caused by distance. The object was close enough that light speed lag was negligible. 11 seconds was simply how long it took whoever was on the other end to decide to answer. That detail, small as it was, told me something important. They had been watching us first. They knew we were here. They were not surprised to be hailed. The voice that came through the channel was human. I recognized the biological register immediately. The soft consonants, the particular resonance of a larynx-based vocal system, the slight breath before each sentence. I had spent enough time monitoring human communications over the past 3 years to know their voices well. This one was a woman's voice. Controlled, steady, carrying the particular quality of someone who gives orders professionally, and has done so for a long time. "This is the UES Leviathan," she said. "Human Commonwealth Navy. Reporting to the Sol system on scheduled escort rotation. Please confirm identity of hailing vessel." I sat very still for a moment. 2 things in that sentence struck me like separate blows. The first was the name, Leviathan. I had studied enough human cultural history to know the word. In the oldest human religious texts, a Leviathan was a creature of such enormous size and power that no living thing could stand against it. Humans had chosen that name deliberately. They were not a species that named things carelessly. The second thing was the phrase that followed, Human Commonwealth Navy. I had not known that humans had a navy. I am a senior observer. My entire professional purpose is to know things. I had read every filed report on the Sol system since humanity was granted probationary council membership. I had reviewed their declared assets, their registered vessels, their stated military capacity. The humans had been transparent, or so I believed. They had signed the probationary accords without a single objection, agreeing to limits on armament grades. on vessel classifications, on weapons systems above defensive Tier 3. They had smiled across the table and signed. And somewhere, in a shipyard that no council censor had ever located, on a timeline that began before those accords were even drafted, they had been building this. I pressed the transmit key. My voice, I am pleased to report, came out entirely level. UES Leviathan, this is Senior Observer Velkarath, aboard the Galactic Council vessel Serene Doctrine. You are operating in a monitored system under probationary accords. Please state your authorization for entry, and provide full vessel classification data. There was a pause. Not a long one, perhaps 3 seconds. Then the woman's voice again, and I could hear, just barely, something in it that might have been amusement, carefully held back. Authorization code follows. Sol 7 Actual. Clearance Delta Prime. Commonwealth Naval Registry Number 441. Vessel classification is a Commonwealth Sovereign Class Strategic Deterrent hull, full specifications of which are available upon formal council request through the Sol System Diplomatic Liaison Office. Another brief pause. Is there anything else you need from us tonight, Observer? I stared at the sensor feed. The object, the Leviathan, was moving now. Slowly, with the unhurried confidence of something that has never once needed to hurry, it was adjusting its heading toward the inner system, toward the inhabited worlds, toward the fragile blue planet where 7 billion humans lived their short, bright, furious lives. Peth was standing very still beside me. Around the monitoring deck, the night shift crew had gone completely quiet. Everyone was watching their screens. Everyone could read the same numbers I was reading. No one was speaking. I looked at the mass reading one more time. 14 million metric tons, moving at a sedate and almost contemptuous pace through a system that until approximately 3 minutes ago I had considered adequately observed and well understood. I opened the channel back to the Leviathan. I had several very serious questions prepared. Questions about authorization, about treaty compliance, about the definition of defensive armament. What I actually said was, "What class did you say that was?" "Sovereign class," the woman replied, calmly, as if this were a perfectly ordinary conversation about a perfectly ordinary ship. I closed the channel. I looked at Peth. Peth looked at me. In 41 years of service, I had written thousands of observation reports. I had never once opened an emergency uplink to the full Galactic Council in the middle of the night cycle. I opened one now. Because the word Navy was still sitting in my mind like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples it was making were getting larger by the second, and I had a feeling, a cold, very specific, professional feeling, that I was looking at something that was going to change every calculation every species in the Council had ever made about the small, young, talkative, apparently disarming species from the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star. I pulled up the emergency relay interface, entered my senior observer authorization, and began to type the most important report of my career. My fingers did not shake, but it was a near thing. Outside, on the sensor feed, the Leviathan continued its approach. Slow, patient, enormous, moving through the dark between the stars as though it owned them, as though it had always owned them and was simply choosing, tonight, to let the rest of us know. I typed faster. The Leviathan crossed the distance between the outer system and the inner orbital lanes in 4 hours. I watched every minute of it. I know that sounds excessive. I have a crew to manage, reports to file, a vessel to help run, but I could not look away. Not because the sight was beautiful, though it was, in a way that had nothing to do with aesthetics, and everything to do with the specific awe you feel when reality refuses to behave the way you expected it to. I could not look away because I am an observer by training and by nature, and what was moving through my visual feed was something I would never see again for the first time, and some part of me understood that clearly even in those early hours. The Leviathan resolved from a sensor ghost to a real image in stages, first as a gravitational signature, then as a thermal bloom, then as a radar return so large the system flagged it twice as a potential input error before accepting the data, and then, finally, on the long-range optical array, it appeared as a shape against the stars. I have tried many times since then to find the right words for that first visual. I have not succeeded. Language is built from experience, and there was no experience in my history that matched what I was seeing. The closest I can come is this. Imagine the largest thing you have ever seen in your life, a mountain range perhaps, or a particularly enormous cloud formation, or the face of a gas giant seen from low orbit. Now imagine that it is moving. Now imagine that it was built, that every surface was designed, every angle chosen, every component placed by deliberate hands with deliberate purpose. The Leviathan was 4.2 kilometers long. I kept running that figure through my head as though repetition would help it make sense. It did not help. 4.2 kilometers is an abstract number. Looking at the ship on my screen, it was not abstract at all. It was a physical fact pressing itself against my understanding and winning. The hull was layered. That was the first thing I noticed beyond the sheer scale. The outer plates were not smooth, the way most council vessel hulls were, designed for clean aerodynamic profiles and minimal sensor cross-section. The Leviathan's hull was built in overlapping planes, each angled slightly differently, each creating a deflection surface that would catch incoming energy or projectiles and redirect them rather than absorb them straight on. My engineering analyst, a heavy-set moon named Korath, pulled up a structural breakdown and stared at it for a long time before he spoke. "Those angles," he said, pointing at the hull geometry on his analysis screen. "That is not an accident." "No," I agreed. Each plate is oriented to redirect impact vectors away from internal systems. Even a glancing hit from a primary-grade energy weapon would shed most of its force laterally. He paused. This hull was designed by someone who spent a great deal of time thinking about what it would be like to be shot at. That sentence stayed with me. I opened a frequency scan while we watched. The Leviathan was radiating on multiple bands, communications, navigational, and what I initially thought were sensor sweeps before Korath corrected me. "Those are targeting systems," he said quietly. "Active. On standby calibration." He looked at me. "They are not targeting us. I want to be clear about that. But they are on. They are running. This ship is scanning everything within a considerable radius." Peth was counting weapon arrays. I had not asked her to. She had simply started counting because she was thorough and good at her job and because, I think, the counting gave her something to do with her hands while her mind processed the larger implications. She counted for a while. Then she stopped. Then she started again from a different section of the hull because she thought she had made an error. She had not made an error. She told me the number. I asked her to double-check it. She did. The number did not change. The Leviathan carried more individual weapon systems than some species fielded in their entire planetary defense networks. Not more advanced necessarily, though the technology appeared formidable by any standard. Simply more. Weapon bays in places where no ship designer in the known galaxy would have thought to put weapon bays. Redundancies upon redundancies, as though the humans who designed this vessel had sat down and asked themselves, what is the worst possible thing that could happen to this ship in a fight? And then asked, and what happens after that? And then asked that question again. The ship had, by Peth's count, 4 separate primary propulsion systems. Any one of them could move the vessel independently. It had 3 reactor cores, each capable of powering the ship in full operational mode on its own. It had a point defense network, layered in concentric rings across the hull, each ring capable of independent operation if the others were destroyed. It was designed, in other words, to keep fighting long after any reasonable assessment would say it should have stopped. I was still sitting with all of this when the Galactic Council emergency channel opened, and every senior official whose uplink I had triggered began speaking at once. Ambassador Teese of the Valorian Compact was loudest. She usually was. "This is a direct violation of the probationary accords," she said, her voice sharp and precise as a blade. "The humans agreed to armament limits. This vessel exceeds every limit in every category. They have deceived the Council." The human diplomatic liaison was already in the channel. His name was Owen Clark, a middle-aged man with the practiced calm of someone who had spent his career in rooms full of very upset people. "Ambassador Thiss," he said, "the Leviathan was laid down 11 years ago. Construction began 8 months before the probationary accords were signed. The vessel, therefore, predates the treaty and is explicitly grandfathered under Article 14, subsection 3 of the Accords, which you will recall was inserted at the insistence of the Kethari Directorate to cover their own pre-existing military assets." There was a silence. "The article covers vessels under 400,000 metric tons, Tis said. Her voice had shifted. The outrage was still there, but underneath it, something else was moving. Calculation. The article specifies no upper mass limit, Clark replied. The Kethari requested that the mass ceiling clause be removed. The council agreed. I have the session records if you'd like to review them. Another silence. Longer this time. I watched the other faces in the channel. Counselor Drac of the elder species, the Ashari, was saying nothing. He was watching Clark the way a very old predator watches something move in the grass, deciding whether it is prey or simply weather. The Kethari representative, Subcommander Yeth, had gone very still, in a way that reminded me, uncomfortably, of someone doing rapid mental arithmetic. The Moon Collective speaker was already muted, which meant they had opened a private channel and were talking among themselves, which was never a reassuring sign. I added my observation data to the council feed in real time. Mass readings, weapon counts, hull analysis, reactor signatures. Every number I added seemed to make the channel quieter. Then Drac spoke. He rarely spoke in emergency sessions. When he did, people listened, because Drac was 412 years old and had been present for things that the rest of us had only read about. Observer Velkarath, he said. Just my name. Nothing else yet. Counselor, I replied. You are looking at this vessel directly, in your professional assessment, and here he paused, and the pause itself felt weighted, the way silences feel when the person holding them is being careful about what comes next. Could the assembled council fleet prevent that ship from doing whatever it wished to do within this system? I did not answer immediately. I owed the question more than an immediate answer. I ran the numbers in my head. Not quickly, carefully, with the full weight of my 41 years, and all the honest accounting I had ever tried to bring to this work. Not without losses, I said, that I would not wish to explain to my children. The channel went very quiet. Tis did not speak again for several minutes. When she did, her voice was different. The blade was still there, but it was sheathed. I would like to formally request a full technical briefing from the Human Commonwealth regarding the specifications of this vessel, she said, through proper diplomatic channels. Clark said he would pass the request along. Someone, somewhere in the council network, leaked my assessment within the hour. I do not know who. I have my suspicions but no proof, and in any case the result was the same regardless of the source. By the following morning, 3 species that had been loudest in opposing humanity's membership upgrade had quietly withdrawn their objections and submitted revised position statements. I noticed the moment I saw the political feeds, but I was still watching the Leviathan on my sensor screen, and a thought had come to me, slowly, the way important thoughts often do, arriving not all at once but piece by piece, until suddenly the whole picture was there and obvious. The humans had not hidden this ship to surprise us. If they had wanted surprise, they would have brought it somewhere that mattered, to a border dispute, to a contested system, to a confrontation, where showing this ship would end the confrontation immediately and decisively. That was how you used a surprise weapon. Instead, they had brought it here, to a routine escort rotation, to a monitored system, in full view of a council observation vessel, broadcasting its own identification code and naval registry number before we even had time to ask for it. Clark had the legal documents ready before Thys finished her first objection. They had answers prepared for every question, filed in offices that had been staffed and briefed well in advance. This was not a surprise. This was a disclosure, managed, timed, and deliberate. They were not showing us the Leviathan as a threat. They were showing us what humanity had decided it needed to exist safely, in a galaxy full of other species, some of whom were ancient and powerful, and not always kind. They were showing us that they had done the math and come to conclusions, and that those conclusions had been translated, over 11 years of labor and planning and expense, into 4.2 kilometers of layered hull and redundant reactors and weapon bays, in places no one else had thought to put weapon bays. And then Clark had mentioned, almost in passing, in the same tone one uses to describe yesterday's weather, she's our 3rd oldest active hull, by the way. 3rd oldest. I sat with that for a long time. Outside my viewport, the stars looked the same as they always had. The Leviathan moved through them slowly, patiently, without urgency. The crew aboard her were probably eating their meals and going about their duties, and not thinking very much about the fact that they had, in a single evening, rearranged every strategic calculation in the known galaxy. Humans, I was coming to understand, were often like that. The enormous things they did often came wrapped in a certain casualness, a refusal to dramatize what they had built or decided or survived. I had thought, at first, that this was naivety. I no longer thought that. I think it was something much more considered, something that takes a very long time, and a very difficult history to learn. I did not sleep that night. I kept watching the feed, and filing reports, and thinking about the word third. The emergency session convened at 0900 station time via quantum relay, and I was patched into it directly from the Serene Doctrine's command deck, because no one had suggested I leave my post, and I had not offered to. 31 species, 31 sets of eyes, biological, mechanical, electromagnetic, all connected through the quantum relay network into a single enormous conversation that was barely holding itself together at the seams. I could see the feed windows stacked in columns on the main display, and the cacophony of simultaneous translation that filled the first 3 minutes of the session was unlike anything I had ever heard, even in the most contentious council meetings of my career. They were all afraid, even the ones performing calm, especially those ones. I had submitted my full sensor analysis before the session opened, and the data had been distributed to all participants, so everyone in that chamber, virtual as it was, had already seen the numbers, the mass readings, the weapon counts, the hull geometry breakdown that Korath had compiled, annotated, and triple-checked because he was the kind of engineer who triple-checked everything, even when he was very frightened, maybe especially then. They had seen all of it, and the seeing had not calmed them. If anything, the seeing had made things worse, because a rumor you cannot confirm leaves room for doubt, and doubt is where hope lives. The numbers I had filed left very little room for either. Council Chair Meraveth, a Syrian whose species communicated through color shifts in their translucent skin as much as through vocalized language, opened the formal session in a shade of deep violet that my translation overlay identified as controlled alarm. Her vocal address was more composed. The Council has received Observer Velkarath's field report. The subject vessel has been confirmed as a human Commonwealth vessel operating under valid registry. The question before this body is whether the presence of this vessel represents a violation of the probationary accords, and if so, what response is appropriate. She had barely finished the sentence before Tis was speaking. There is no question, the Valorian ambassador said. The vessel in question exceeds every reasonable interpretation of the armament limits accepted by the human delegation. The sheer mass of this hull alone constitutes a strategic weapon under any functional definition. The humans signed those accords. They were present. They understood the intent. Owen Clark did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice, I had noticed. The angrier the room got, the quieter and more precise he became, as though he were simply adjusting his register to be heard more clearly against the noise. The accords set specific, enumerated limits, he said. Mass limits were specifically removed from the treaty text at the request of a current council member. Weapon system restrictions apply to grades above defensive Tier 3. The Leviathan's primary armaments are classified under Commonwealth Naval Registry as strategic deterrent systems, which fall under a separate definitional category that the accords do not address, because the Council's treaty drafters did not anticipate this category existing. He paused. That is an oversight in the treaty language, and we are happy to discuss updating the accords going forward, but it does not constitute a violation of the current text. Thies pressed. The intent of the accords. Intent is not text, Clark said. Still quiet. Still steady. If the Council wishes to write intent into binding law, we can schedule those negotiations. The human Commonwealth will participate in good faith. I watched the faces in the windows as this exchange continued. Thies was building her case methodically, and it was a good case. There was real legal argument in what she was saying, even if the textual ground was shakier than she wanted it to be. But I was watching the others more than I was watching her. The Kethari Directorate's representative, Sub-Commander Yeth, had not spoken. He was looking at the technical specifications Korath had compiled. He had been looking at them, without interruption, for the better part of 20 minutes. I had worked alongside Kethari officers before. They were engineers at heart, their entire military culture built around the principle that a problem understood is a problem half solved. Yeth was not angry. He was studying. That was, possibly, more concerning. The Moon Collective had 3 representatives in the session, which was unusual. They typically sent 1. All 3 were present and none of them had muted their feed this time, which meant they wanted to be visible, which meant they were performing a message. I filed that away. Counselor Drax sat in his usual position, slightly back from the main table, slightly out of the primary camera frame, as though he were a spectator rather than a participant. He had not spoken yet in this session. He was the only person in that chamber, I suspected, who had seen something like this before. Not this ship, not this species, but this moment. The moment when a new force enters a room, and the room has to decide what it is. I was asked to give a live briefing midway through the session. I pulled up my sensor feed and walked the council through what I was seeing. In the measured professional language I have spent 4 decades cultivating, I described the hull geometry. I described the reactor configuration. I described the point defense layering, and the redundant propulsion systems, and the weapon array distribution. I answered questions as they came. Some questions were technical. Some were political, thinly disguised as technical. I answered the technical ones fully, and redirected the political ones to Clark, who handled them with his characteristic, almost eerie composure. Then Drax spoke. He did not frame it as a dramatic moment. He simply waited for a pause in the questioning and used it. "I have a question for the observer," he said, in that unhurried voice of his that always made every other voice in the room sound slightly rushed by comparison. Not a technical question. "Of course, Counselor," I said. "If," he said, and the word was careful, precise, clearly chosen over other words, "if the Council were to determine that a response of force was warranted, if the full assembled defensive fleet were directed toward this vessel, in your professional estimation," another pause, "not for drama, for accuracy, could we stop it?" The channel went very still. I did not want to answer, not because I did not know the answer, because I knew it precisely, and I knew what it meant. But Drac was asking me the direct question in a direct session, and my entire professional identity is built on honest reporting, and so I did what I always do, which is tell the truth even when the truth is uncomfortable. "Not without losses," I said, "that I would not wish to explain to my children." The channel did not erupt. That surprised me. I had expected eruption. Instead, there was silence, and the silence had a texture to it, the texture of 31 species processing simultaneously and arriving, separately, at roughly the same place. Tiss spoke first, but her voice was different now. The blade was still there. It was always there with Tiss. It was part of her professional architecture, but it was sheathed. "I would like to formally request a full technical briefing from the Human Commonwealth regarding the Leviathan specifications, through proper diplomatic channels." Clark confirmed he would pass the request along. Within the hour, as I mentioned, my assessment had found its way into the political feeds. Within 2 hours, 3 formal objections to humanity's membership upgrade had been revised, restated, or quietly withdrawn. No one announced these withdrawals. They simply happened, in the bureaucratic way that many important things happen, through updated filings and amended position statements, and the small, silent shifts that occur when the available information changes. I watched this happen from my console on the Serene Doctrine. The Leviathan was still on my sensor feed. It had settled into a standard orbital pattern around the outer system waypoint, moving slowly and steadily, generating exactly the sensor profile you would expect from a vessel on routine escort duty. The crew aboard it were not doing anything dramatic. They were just there, present, enormous, patient. A thought was forming in my mind. I kept pushing it back, because I wanted to be sure of it before I let it settle. Thoughts about species-level strategy require a certain careful handling, because once you believe something about a species, truly believe it, in the deep professional part of your assessment, it colors everything that follows. So I pushed the thought back and examined the data again, from a different angle, looking for holes in the conclusion. I did not find any. The thought was this: the humans had not built the Leviathan to fight. They had built it so that fighting would never be necessary. There is a difference between those two things that sounds subtle and is actually vast. A ship built to fight is pointed outward, toward the enemy. A ship built so that fighting will never be necessary is pointed inward, toward the people it protects. The entire design philosophy, every redundancy, and every layer of defense, and every weapon system positioned to keep the vessel operational, long after reason said it should be done, all of it was the expression of a species that had decided, with full seriousness, that it would not be destroyed, not by accident, not by negligence, not by being outgunned in a dark corner of the galaxy by something older and less restrained. They had decided they would survive, and then they had built the infrastructure of that decision and parked it in a monitored system where the people who most needed to understand it could see it clearly. I filed my midday report to the council. I added a note at the end, marked as personal observation rather than official assessment, because it was not my place to make policy recommendations, and I knew that. But I also knew that some things need to be said by someone. The note said, "Recommend immediate elevation of humanity to full council membership, not because of the ship, because of the people who built it, and why, and what they chose to do with it." I submitted the report and turned back to the feed. Outside, the Leviathan kept its patient circuit. Around it, very quietly, the galaxy was rearranging itself. She met me at the airlock with a handshake, which I knew was a human greeting gesture, and which she offered without hesitation or any sign of self-consciousness, as though shaking hands with a six-limbed Ishari-adjacent observer from the Galactic Council was something she did every other Tuesday. Her name was Commander Laura Holt. She was the executive officer of the Leviathan, not the captain, I noted, which meant the captain had sent his second-in-command to give me the tour. I considered whether this was a slight, then considered it more carefully, then concluded it was probably not. Laura Holt carried herself like someone who was very good at her job and knew it, and who had learned that she did not need to perform confidence because the confidence was simply already there. "Welcome aboard," she said. "The captain sends his apologies. He's in a briefing with Commonwealth Naval Command. They want a full account of last night's council session." "I imagine they do," I said. She smiled. It was a quick smile, genuine and without calculation. "So does everyone. Honestly. Follow me. I'll start at the bow and we'll work aft." The corridors of the Leviathan were not what I had expected. I had anticipated something sterile and institutional, a functional space designed for efficiency above all else. Military vessels across most species tended toward that aesthetic: bare surfaces, minimal color, the architecture of purpose stripped down to its essentials. The Leviathan was not like that. The corridors were wide, wider than necessary for the crew who walked them, and the walls were marked with the evidence of habitation, equipment stenciled with nicknames, a hand-painted mural near the first crew intersection showing a night sky that I recognized as Earth's, with constellations I did not know rendered in careful detail, scuff marks at knee height along the lower bulkhead of a particularly busy section, the kind that accumulate over years of people turning corners too fast. A rack of personal photographs behind glass near the galley entrance, dozens of faces, civilian and young and belonging to people who were not here, but who were thought of anyway. The ship smelled of machine oil, and something hot and slightly bitter that I later learned was called coffee. People moved through the corridors with the ease of people who know exactly where they are going, and have known it for a long time. They acknowledged Commander Holt with nods and small salutes and occasional words, brief and informal. They looked at me with open curiosity and, as far as I could tell, no anxiety at all. "How long has this crew been together?" I asked, as we passed through a pressurized junction marked with what appeared to be a stylized shark's mouth painted around the doorframe. "Most of them, 4 to 6 years, Holt said. "Some of the senior crew have been on the Leviathan since the commissioning. Captain Aldridge has been aboard 9 years. And before this posting? Some came from smaller ships, some from ground assignments. A few were pulled from research programs." She glanced sideways at me. "We recruit broadly. The Commonwealth doesn't believe in putting one kind of mind in one kind of job." I thought about that as we walked. "You said the captain has been aboard 9 years. The ship has been operational for approximately that long?" 10 years, 2 months, she said, without having to think about it. The number was simply there, ready, the way important numbers are for people who care about them. 10 years of active service. operating presumably throughout the period during which the Galactic Council had been carefully and thoroughly cataloging human space assets. We were not aware, I said, carefully, that this vessel existed. Holt stopped at a viewport, a wide one, looking out along the port flank of the hull, and the scale of what I could see through the glass was extraordinary, the hull stretching away so far that its far end was lost in the perspective of it, and she looked out for a moment before answering. No, she agreed, you weren't. The shielding on this vessel against Council sensor frequencies is very thorough, she said simply. I stood beside her and looked out at the hull, at the layered plating, the angles, the weapon bays embedded in the structure so seamlessly that you would not see them unless you knew to look. 11 years of planning and construction, 10 years of operation, and in all that time, not a single sensor ping from the most sophisticated monitoring network in the known galaxy had returned anything that suggested this ship existed. I would like to ask you something, I said, and I would like an honest answer, though I recognize I have no particular right to demand one. She turned from the viewport. Her expression was attentive, not guarded. Attentive. Why? I said. Not the legal justification, not the treaty language. Why did your species decide to build this? She was quiet for a moment, not the defensive quiet of someone organizing an evasion, the thoughtful quiet of someone who has an honest answer and is deciding how much of it to give. Have you ever studied human history? She asked. I have reviewed summaries, I said. How about in detail? I considered. Not in detail, no. She nodded, as though this confirmed something. Our history is approximately 200,000 years of our species existing. Of those 200,000 years, the last 100 or so have involved things like global coordination, space travel, medicine that actually works, enough food for most people. She paused. The other 199,900 were complicated. Complicated. Wars, plagues, groups of humans deciding that other groups of humans didn't deserve to exist, and doing something about that belief. Natural disasters that ended civilizations, famines, extinctions of things we loved. She said all of this with a matter-of-factness that struck me more than grief would have. Grief can be a performance. This was simply the reporting of facts. We know, better than most species you've ever encountered, what it looks like when things go badly wrong. Because things have gone badly wrong for us. Repeatedly. Throughout our entire recorded existence. She turned back to the viewport. Outside, the stars moved slowly past as the Leviathan continued its circuit. When we made it out here, she said, we didn't arrive as innocents. We arrived as a species that had read our own history very carefully and come to some very specific conclusions about what the universe is like and what it can do to you if you are not paying attention. She was quiet for a moment. We built the Leviathan because we decided that we would not be caught unprepared. Not again. Never again. She said the last two words with a particular weight. Not anger. Certainty. I stood beside her and looked at the hull and thought about 200,000 years, about what it deposits in a species, what it teaches, what it makes you build when you finally get the tools to build it. The weapon systems, I said. The redundancies. The hull design. All of it is oriented defensively, isn't it? Even the offensive arrays. Their placement is calculated to function as deterrence rather than first-strike capacity. She looked at me then, and there was something in her expression that I can only describe as surprised satisfaction, the look of a teacher whose student has said the right thing unexpectedly. Yes, she said, exactly that. You did not build this ship to win a war, I said. We built it, she said, so that one would never start. We walked the rest of the ship without hurry. She showed me the reactor cores, 3 of them, each housed in its own hardened compartment, each capable of running the ship fully operational on its own, each designed so that the failure of any 2 would not affect the third. She showed me the medical bay, which was larger than the medical facilities on most Council vessels, twice the Leviathan's size. She showed me the crew recreation spaces and the small garden compartment near the center of the ship, where someone was growing herbs under artificial sunlight, and the smell was warm and green, and completely at odds with the scale and armament of the vessel surrounding it. Near the stern, she took me through the marine berths, rows of personal spaces, personalized with the same comfortable informality I had seen everywhere. People making homes out of the space the ship gave them. A young man was reading in his bunk, off duty, and he looked up when we passed and gave Holt a casual wave and me a curious nod, and then went back to his book. At the aft airlock, where I would transfer back to the Serene Doctrine, she stopped and faced me, the handshake again, firm and direct. "We hope," she said, and her voice was quieter now, not carrying the open ease of the corridor conversations, more considered, more personal, that we never have to use her. Everything on this ship, every weapon, every defense, every redundant system, we hope it all stays in standby mode for the next 50 years. We hope the Leviathan becomes famous for being the ship that never fired a shot in anger. She let go of my hand. But we built her. We built her so that hope has somewhere to stand. I stepped through the airlock. I rode the transit pod back to the Serene Doctrine. I sat down at my console and pulled up the sensor feed, and looked at the Leviathan from the outside again. It was the same ship, same mass reading, same hull geometry, same weapon arrays, same steady patient circuit of the outer system. Nothing about it had changed. But I was looking at it differently. And looking at it differently, I found I was looking at the humans differently too. All 7 billion of them on that blue planet, and the ones aboard this ship, and the ones in offices and shipyards and research facilities who had spent a decade building something they hoped would never be needed, because they knew what needed looked like and they had decided, with the full weight of their complicated, difficult, extraordinary history, that they would not let that happen again. I pulled up a new report file, began to type. The vote passed at 0630 station time, 11 days after the Leviathan's arrival. Not unanimously. I want to be clear about that, because honesty matters, and the picture is not complete without the complications. 6 species voted against, 4 abstained, but the majority held, and the formal certification went through on a clean roll call, and the human commonwealth was elevated from probationary to full Galactic Council membership, with all the rights and protections and obligations that designation carries. I was still aboard the Serene Doctrine when the result came through. I had not returned to Council headquarters because my observation post was here, in this system, where the thing that had triggered the vote was still quietly orbiting. I watched the certification announcement on my relay screen and felt something I had not expected to feel, which was a complicated kind of relief, the feeling of a door opening rather than closing. In the corridor outside the council session chamber, captured on the feed because someone had left a relay active, I heard a Valorian attaché, not Tease herself, one of the junior staff, say to a colleague that humanity was dangerous and that the council had just made a grave mistake. His tone was not entirely wrong. Genuine danger exists, and naming it is not foolishness. But I heard what the colleague said back, and the colleague was a Kethari officer, Subcommander Yeth's aide, a young woman named, I checked the feed records, Specialist Oren, small and precise and unhesitating. "They're not dangerous," she said. "They're disciplined. There's a difference." The Valorian attaché looked at her. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. I wrote that exchange down. It is in my personal log, not my official reports. Some things belong in the personal log. The weeks following the vote were busy in the way that major political shifts are always busy. Not with dramatic events, but with the endless administrative texture of change, new treaty protocols, revised trade classifications, formal diplomatic exchange schedules. Humanity accepted all of it with the same patience and thoroughness that Clark had shown in the council chamber, working through the bureaucratic requirements of full membership with a kind of quiet diligence that I found, paradoxically, more impressive than the Leviathan itself. The Leviathan remained in the system through that period, completing its scheduled escort rotation. Other human vessels arrived and departed, smaller ones, registered civilian and research craft, operating exactly within the terms of the now updated accords, visible and compliant, and completely unremarkable. I filed routine observation reports on them. The contrast with that first night was not lost on me. 3 months after the vote, a situation developed in the outer fringe. The outer fringe is a designation for a region of space that the Council technically claims jurisdiction over, but has never been able to effectively patrol. It is too large, too diffuse, and too far from the central systems where Council resources are concentrated. Several species operate in the fringe with a degree of freedom that would not be tolerated closer to the core systems, and the Council has tolerated this for decades, because the alternative, projecting enough force into the fringe to enforce standards, has always cost more than the member states were willing to pay. The Rel Dominion was one of those species, not signatories to the Council, not recognized as full members, and not interested in becoming any such thing. Their raider squadrons operated in the fringe with something close to impunity, preying on independent traders and small colony outposts, staying just below the threshold that would provoke a formal Council response. They had been doing this for 40 years. The Council had issued resolutions. The Rel had ignored them. Nothing had changed. Until the morning a Rel raider squadron of 11 vessels entered the fringe system designated K7 and found something already there. I was not present. I read the incident report 3 days later, forwarded to my console from Council intelligence. The report was compiled from the Rel squadron's own communications, which had been intercepted and decoded, and from the sensor records of 2 Council observation drones that happened to be in the system on unrelated survey duty. The Rel commander had hailed the vessel that was already in K7 and demanded identification, standard approach for a species that treats intimidation as a first contact protocol. The response had come back in trade tongue, clean and unaccented. The response was one word: deterrent. The Rel commander had then requested, not demanded, requested, which was itself a departure from their standard approach, the vessel's designation and authority. The response: UES Leviathan, Human Commonwealth Navy, operating under Galactic Council member authority in defense of Council-claimed space. What followed, according to the intercepted communications, was 14 minutes of the Rel squadron's internal channel traffic, which the Council decoders described as chaotic. Multiple officers speaking over each other, at least one technical assessment being read aloud, mass figures, weapon estimates, threat classification that went off the top of the scale their systems used. Then the Rel commander's voice again, giving an order. The order was, withdraw, maintain current heading away from the system at maximum standard drive. Do not escalate, do not provoke. The squadron withdrew. No shots were fired. No warning was given beyond a name. The Leviathan had not moved from its position in the system, had not powered up its weapons, had not done anything except be there and be itself. The Rel Dominion's raider activity in the outer fringe dropped by 63% over the following 6 weeks. I sat with the incident report for a long time. Outside my viewport, the stars were doing what stars do, burning, slowly, in the enormously patient way of things that have existed far longer than anything that looks at them. The Leviathan was not visible from my current position. It was elsewhere in the system, but I knew the sensor signature of it by now, the way you know the face of someone you have watched for months, and I could have found it on any screen I chose to look at. I thought about Commander Holt's words at the airlock, about hope having somewhere to stand, about the garden in the center of the ship where someone grew herbs under artificial light, surrounded by 14 million metric tons of calculated protection. I thought about what Specialist Oren had said in the corridor, disciplined, not dangerous, and I thought about the distinction between those two things, and how easy it is to confuse them when you are looking from the outside, and how important it is not to. Then I thought about something that had been circling in the back of my mind since that first night, since the mass alarm went off at 03:47, and I had sat up in the dark and read a number that made my secondary heart stutter, something that I had been slowly building toward without fully knowing it, the way conclusions sometimes arrive after the evidence has been sitting with you long enough. We had spent 3 years studying humanity before their probationary application. We had sent observers, filed reports, cataloged their technology, their political systems, their cultural patterns, their history. We had debated extensively whether they were ready for the galaxy, whether the galaxy was ready for them, whether their particular combination of capability and volatility made them an asset or a risk to the stability of the Council and its member worlds. We had been asking the wrong question. The right question, the one that the Leviathan made unavoidable, that Commander Holt had answered at an airlock with 3 quiet words, that Specialist Oren had captured in a corridor with a single precise word. The right question was not what humanity might do to the galaxy. It was what they might do for it. Because the Leviathan had not fired a shot in 10 years of active service. Because a raider squadron had withdrawn from a system it had terrorized for decades after hearing a single word. Because the crew of a 14 million metric ton warship grew herbs and hung photographs and read books in their bunks. Because they made a home out of a weapon and lived in it with the easy comfort of people who are not looking for a fight and know, with deep certainty, that they are capable of finishing one. Because when the REL withdrew from K7, the worlds in that system, small outpost colonies, most of them, the kind of communities that the Council had never adequately protected and everyone knew it, those worlds were still there the next day, and the day after, and the day after that. I filed my quarterly observation report. It was long, longer than any report I had filed in years, because there was more to say, and because saying it carefully seemed important. I made the case for full membership, the case for constructive integration, the case for treating humanity as a partner in the work of keeping the outer fringe and the border regions and the places the Council had always neglected from becoming places where only the powerful survived. At the end, I added a note. Personal observation, as before, but this time I did not mark it as unofficial. I let it stand as part of the record. The note said, "We spent a great deal of time worrying about what humanity might do to this galaxy. We ran projections, built risk models, debated escalation scenarios. All of it was reasonable, and none of it was wrong, exactly. But in our focus on what they might take, we failed to notice what they were offering. In our attention to the weapon, we missed the hand that held it, and the face behind the hand, and the 200,000 years of memory and learning and survival that had shaped both. We are not the first species to encounter something we did not understand, and choose fear over curiosity. We probably will not be the last. But I have watched humanity for 3 years, and the Leviathan for 3 months, and I have sat in an airlock and shaken a hand, and been told that hope needs somewhere to stand, and I believe that. I believe that the galaxy, which is very old and in many ways very tired, has just acquired something it did not know it needed. A species that has read its own worst history, and decided not to repeat it. A species that builds enormous, patient, careful things, and hopes, very sincerely, that those things are never used. A species that grows herbs in the middle of a warship and names it after a creature from the oldest stories, and sends it to a monitored system and answers the hail before you finish sending it. I am glad they found us. I said that to Peth, who had been with me through all of it, who had counted the weapon arrays and gone pale, and kept working anyway. I said, I am glad humanity found us first, and not something else. She thought about it. She is young, Peth. She still thinks carefully about things before she agrees to them, which is a quality I have tried not to train out of her. Then she said, me too. Outside the viewport, the stars burned. Somewhere in the system, patient and present and ready for a fight it did not want and would not start, the Leviathan kept its watch. And the galaxy, quietly, continued.